Last night, I was recording on the beaches alongside our famous white cliffs of Dover. In the darkness and far out at sea, you could just about make out small flickers of light. They were coming from mobile phones in the hands of migrants, people making the perilous crossing to England from France. They were using their phones to guide them as they huddled together in tightly packed dinghies. When they reached these shores, they were cold and frightened, but also happy and relieved. They'd survived a journey across one of the world's busiest shipping lanes, a journey that could have killed them. And once in Britain, they should be safe and have the chance of a better life. But what do we really know about these people? How can we, as journalists, do more to make sure that we're not being taken in? It's a question I wouldn't have even asked myself a year or so ago. And the reason I'm sitting here talking to you now is to reflect on a search for the truth in one particular case that I've covered. That case has taken me around the globe, and I'd like to share it with you. The story is about an Afghan family in Iran and a former British soldier, but we'll come to him later. At the heart of it is a mother, Goli, one of the bravest and most determined women I've ever met. And it's about what she did when her daughter was taken from the family home. You might be sitting there wondering what child abduction has to do with migrants heading to Britain. The story starts in the Calais jungle, a huge makeshift camp that's stretched out along sand dunes near the French border. Back in 2016, thousands of refugees were living there in tents. It was a kind of unauthorised holding camp for migrants determined to cross illegally into Britain by lorry or boat. People could be there for months, years even. There were shops and food stalls, even a makeshift mosque. I went there as a reporter for the BBC to cover the story of one little girl in that sea of refugees. Journalists have a responsibility to tell the world what's happening in these camps. What I learned is that it's hard to remain impartial and even harder to get to the truth. The migrants interviewed by reporters are usually men. Their stories about wars and persecution get cut down into sound bites for the news. As journalists, we easily miss the voices of women who come from cultures where they're often not allowed to speak up. I think it's a flaw in our journalism, but if you'd asked me about that back in Calais in 2016, I'd probably have told you that my instincts were good. I was an experienced reporter when I first met Goli's missing daughter, Bru, and her ex-husband, Reza. I was taken in and deceived by him. Some good eventually came from our meeting. It's taught me how nigh on impossible it is to tell an economic migrant from an asylum seeker, to make out the truth from the lies. And it certainly made me understand from bitter experience what I once knew only in theory, that in many parts of the world women are abused and denied justice. First, let me tell you about the little girl, Bru. When I met her in that Calais camp, she was instantly captivating. She was wearing bright pink Wellington boots. She was 4, and she had the biggest brown eyes and an impish grin. She didn't speak much English, but she was a great mimic. She'd listen and take a few phrases in and then run them together in a funny voice. Then she'd laugh, and I did too. I noticed that her dad didn't pay her much attention. I assumed he was just preoccupied, trying to get through each day in that camp. It wasn't right that Bru and so many other kids were living there, playing in filthy mud. It was bitterly cold. The wind swept off the sea and across the dunes. The camp stank from an open sewer that ran along the back of Bru's tent. When it rained, this effluent overflowed and snaked between the shelters. Bru and her dad Reza spent their days surrounded by the noise of different voices in different languages, people packed in together, talking about the lives they hoped to have in Britain. As night set in, they'd make campfires and share what little food they had. They talked about the countries they'd travelled through to get this far and the countries they'd fled. There were many more men in Calais than women. At first, I was a bit apprehensive approaching people in the camp, but the longer you're there, the more you relax. People tell you their stories willingly, how the smugglers operate, how much it costs to reach the UK. Reza said he didn't have enough money to pay smugglers. He'd need thousands to get a place on a lorry for himself, and the price for brew was much higher. Children are risky. You never know when they might wake up and cry. I came into this story and met Reza and Brew because an attempt to smuggle Brew and send her on ahead to Britain from the camp had just gone very badly wrong. It was a big news story at the time. It made headlines around the world. You might remember it. It involved the former British soldier I mentioned at the start. His name's Rob Laurie. Rob had put his own life in the UK on hold to go to work as a volunteer in the Calais camp. He'd been moved by images of a little Syrian boy who died out at sea. Rob started driving his van back and forth from his home in the UK to Calais, bringing supplies, and that's how he'd met Brew. She followed him around as he was putting up shelters. Her father, Reza, told Rob that they were fleeing the Taliban in Afghanistan, that his wife had been killed, and that they needed to reach relatives in the UK. The story touched Rob's heart. In a moment of madness, Rob did something completely out of character. He agreed to smuggle them both across the French border into Britain in his van. On a bleak, cold night, Rob pulled his van into a deserted side street near the camp. The van had a small compartment in the roof above the driver's seat. By torchlight, Reza tried to squeeze himself in. He couldn't, but there was enough room for Brew. As a mother, I'd never have handed my daughter to a man I barely knew. But Reza didn't hesitate. He said he'd follow later, and he gave Rob the address of an aunt in the UK who'd take Brew in. But they never got that far. When Rob pulled up at the French border in Calais, sniffer dogs picked up a scent from the van. Brew was discovered, and Rob was charged with smuggling. He faced up to 10 years in jail. He'd done something really stupid on an impulse, out of pity for a refugee. It was Rob's poor skills at smuggling, but his big heart at trying, that caught the attention of the world's media. Lots of journalists, including me, descended on the Calais camp. Everyone wanted to meet Brew and find out why Rob had taken such a risk to help her. Every one of us was taken in. I did question Reza about fleeing Afghanistan and his dead wife. He showed me a letter he said was from the Taliban, and a translator confirmed it was a death threat. Reza also said he had another child, a baby son, that he'd had to leave behind with relatives. He hadn't left Brew, he said, because Afghanistan was so dangerous for girls. I've often discussed with Rob since then why we didn't nail down the details, but there wasn't really any way to do that. Reza said he'd had documents and family photos, but they were washed away at sea as he was crossing from Turkey to Greece. At the time, it didn't strike me as strange that that letter from the Taliban had survived. Hands up, we were had. In a small library in the Calais camp, there was a map of the world. Refugees were asked to place a pin by the countries that they'd come from. Brew's pin was in the wrong place. But it was only 2 years later that Rob and I found out that Reza had not been fleeing the Taliban. He'd taken his little girl from the family home in Iran. His wife wasn't dead. There was no baby son with relatives, but there was another daughter, Baran, that he'd abandoned along with his wife when he decided to head for Britain. Reza took Brew because a child makes it easier to claim asylum in the UK. The refugee crisis was a cover for Reza, who was an economic migrant. Brew was his ticket to a better life. That doesn't mean that all migrants are liars, of course not. Some would argue that immigration laws are so strict that people are forced to embellish their stories to fit the rules. Some people would allow much freer access by economic migrants to wealthier countries. But the difficulty in proving the truth of individual accounts means there may often be room for doubt. It places a much greater duty of impartiality on journalists, a duty to stand back a little, to allow for the possibility of lies. If we don't, we're telling something complicated much too simply. We're drafting a very superficial history, ignoring hidden injustices, different problems that need different solutions. When I first reported from the Calais jungle, I didn't imagine what I wrote would ever be read by Goldie, would bring a mother the hope she'd been longing for, that her child was alive. Goldie hadn't been able to contact Reza and Brew since he left the family home in Tehran. She'd been out with the baby that day and came back to find her husband and daughter gone. At first, Reza's family had taken her and Baran in, but over the weeks that followed, Goldie'd realised they'd known about his plan to try to join relatives in Britain. She overheard them speaking to Reza on the phone, but when Goldie begged to hear her little girl's voice, they refused. Goldie feared that they'd take her youngest child from her as well, that they'd one day shut their door on her, leaving her with nothing. She went to the police and tried to take a case through the courts in Iran, accusing Reza of abduction. Eventually, her own family raised the money to pay smugglers to help her go after Brew, taking her baby Baran in her arms. She travelled for weeks by foot across mountains and rivers, through forests and moving between safe houses but never feeling safe, always terrified she might be raped or attacked by smugglers. When she got to Turkey, she was reunited with her own mom, who'd gone there as a migrant many years before. Her mom wanted her to stay, but Goldie knew she needed to carry on searching for Brew. That journey was cut short in Denmark when Baran got sick. They were given asylum there, but the police and the Red Cross told Goldie there was little hope of ever finding Brew. Then one day, quite by chance, Goldie read the story of Rob Laurie, Brew and Reza, a story I'd written for the BBC News website. There was a link to radio documentaries I'd made, and Goldie heard my recordings of her husband and, more importantly, her daughter. A Danish refugee worker helped her to get in touch with me and Rob. Goldie had documents to prove her version of events. There were lots of them: birth certificates, police statements, court records and identity cards. We eventually offered to help her find her little girl, and that wasn't easy. By this time, the Calais camp had been demolished and Reza and Brew had disappeared. How we found them both is a story in itself. I recorded it with Rob Laurie, and you can hear it on our podcast, Girl Taken. How Goldie and Brew were reunited after 5 years apart. How we confronted Reza with the lies he told us in the Calais jungle. And in those recordings, there's also parts of the migrant experience that seldom get covered by journalists. What happens to people who arrive illegally and disappear into life in the West? We used social media to find migrants we'd met in Calais. Ziggy, who'd been smuggled to the UK on the back of a lorry and was now getting the education he'd dreamed of. Solomon, with his new flat in Glasgow. And Mustafa, who was too busy even to speak to us. He was now the manager of a car wash in Preston and was branching out into motor repairs. Looking back, we were struck by how many men in the Calais camp had had a single child with them. We spoke to an international human rights lawyer who'd noticed exactly the same thing herself, scanning the faces in the camps and boats. So many men with a single child, where were the mothers? Reza presented himself and Bru as refugees from war, but his life was never in danger. He'd left a wife and child to carve out a more prosperous future for himself, and he'd taken Bru to make things easier. Goldie had had an arranged marriage to a man who eventually took her daughter and left her behind. She and Reza were from Afghan families. Their parents had made it as refugees into Iran, and she says she's far from alone in what's happened to her. So I felt the last words should come from Goldie. In these COVID times, she can't be here with me. So instead I asked Goldie, how can we do better when it comes to reporting the truth? Goldie said we should try to remember that the first voices we hear, the loudest voices, are not always the most truthful. Sometimes we have to try harder, dig deeper, and hope that we can pick up the voices of the distant women, women who are made to whisper or to bottle up injustices. I'm proud to have been able to give voice to Goldie's story and to have played my part in finally tracing her little girl.